The windshield wipers struggled against the heavy snow, smearing white slush across the glass. The engine of the old Nissan roared in frustration, wheels spinning helplessly. Michael tried to reverse again, but the car lurched and settled deeper into the snowbank. He shifted into neutral and leaned back into the cold seat. He was still 100 miles from Denver. Most of the drive was already behind him when his tires lost grip, sending him sliding off the road and into the ditch. Michael tugged his knit cap tighter, slipped on his gloves, and stepped out into the biting wind. A silence surrounded him, cold, brittle, unbroken. The gray sky dumped more snow, lazy clouds rolling by in endless monotony. He glanced at his car. The hood was buried up to the headlights, the front bumper tangled with branches poking through the snow. Turning back, he eyed the dark tracks his tires had left, remembering the stomach-dropping moment when he'd cursed, loudly, as the car skidded off the highway. With a sigh, he climbed back inside, rubbed his icy hands together, and pulled out his phone. It was 3:30 p.m. Winter's early sunset was coming. He had to act fast. A polite voice on the other end informed him that the roads were impassable. The tow truck wouldn't reach him until morning, or maybe later. The woman's warm, detached tone made him picture her, sitting comfortably in a heated office while he froze in his car. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He was a city guy. The thought of running out of gas and being consumed by the cold, drop by drop, was enough to make his hands tremble. He hadn't heard any storm warnings. The snowstorm had begun after. He left the city, and within hours, it had turned the road into a thick, unending blanket of white. Michael called emergency services, praying for a rescue SUV to pull him out. Another polite voice, equally indifferent, told him they'd do their best, but realistically, he'd be waiting until dawn. "It's impossible to get to you right now," she said slowly, as if he were a child. "I recommend looking for a nearby town or shelter. There are a lot of small communities along the highway." "Thanks," he whispered, lowering the phone onto his lap. The suffocating silence pressed in. The faint crackle of music from the car speakers did nothing to ease it. There's a certain kind of quiet, cold and lonely, that no song or shout can break. Michael refused to give up. He tried over and over to drive out of the snowbank. The engine growled, steam rising from the hood as snowflakes melted on the hot metal, forming an icy crust. The storm wrapped the car tighter, lulling him into exhausted frustration. An hour passed. He was panting. Then he screamed in anger, slamming his fist on the horn. The sharp blare echoed into the emptiness, shattering against distant snow-clad trees. He glanced at the fuel gauge. The needle trembled near halfway. Gathering his things, he stepped out again. The temperature had plummeted. His breath billowed in thick clouds. "Where do I go now?" he muttered, wrapping his scarf tightly around his face. His clothes weren't made for this. A leather jacket, a button-down shirt, a simple knit cap, and a scarf. Enough to keep him warm inside the car, but not out here. Climbing a small hill to get a better view, he peered through the swirling white. There, beyond a sparse line of birch and maple trees, he spotted the crooked roofs of a small settlement. Abandoning his car to the storm, he headed toward the houses. Each step was a struggle. Snow filled his boots, the wind stinging his face with icy flakes. Half an hour passed. The sky darkened. A deep blue dusk stretched out the shadows, pushing him onward. As he neared the buildings, Michael realized his mistake. This wasn't a town. The ruins of collapsed houses jutted like broken teeth from the snow. Skeletal fence posts pierced the drifts, and only one structure remained standing, a modest one-story house with an attic. Its upper window flapped open, banging in the wind. Yet strangely, a path to the door was clear of snow, either shoveled recently or walked upon. Michael scuffed the fresh powder aside with his boot, hesitated, and knocked loudly. Silence. Only the wind howled from above. He knocked again, waited, listened. Nothing. With a sigh, he pushed the door. It creaked open, revealing the dark interior of the house. The wind died as he stepped inside. Fading daylight filtered through frosted windows, casting cold shadows over forgotten furniture. The room was large and square, cluttered with old things. A low bed sat against the far wall, neatly covered with a patchwork quilt. A rough wooden table stood by the window, dried herbs dangled from the ceiling, and dusty jars lined the shelves. But all of that was secondary because, in the center of the room, standing like a white monolith, was an old wood stove. Driven by desperation, Michael rushed to it, rubbing his numb hands. The inside of the stove was dry. It hadn't been used in ages. He considered breaking apart one of the sturdy chairs for fuel, but remembered the cleared path outside. Someone might still be around. Instead, he went back out, broke some branches off a leaning fence, and returned to the stove. Within minutes, a small fire crackled, warm, reassuring. He shrugged off his freezing jacket, laying it over the stove to dry. The heat seeped into his back as he leaned against the stove, finally exhaling with relief. "It's not so bad," he muttered, pulling off his wet boots. Outside, the snowstorm raged, wind battering the walls and windows. But inside, the fire crackled and popped, spreading orange warmth through the room. The frost in his breath disappeared. Weariness crept over him, that bone-deep exhaustion that follows a hard chill. His eyes drooped, and before he knew it, his head fell forward. He drifted into a restless sleep. Michael jolted awake at the sound of a loud thud above him. The noise echoed through the dim room, sharp and jarring, making his heart hammer against his ribs. The attic window had slammed shut again, and another icy gust swept through the cracks, cutting into the silence. He stretched, joints popping, as warmth slowly crept back into his limbs. A shiver crawled down his spine, and his eyes settled on the narrow, rickety staircase leading up to the attic. The first step groaned under his weight. The wood beneath him creaked, a brittle protest against his presence. He climbed cautiously, fingers gripping the banister like a lifeline. The air grew colder with every step, the fire's warmth left behind, replaced by the sharp bite of winter seeping through the boards. At the top, he hesitated. His flashlight cut through the gloom, its narrow beam sweeping across the attic. The space was small and cramped, cobwebs sagging from low beams. An old bed sat beneath the window, the frame crooked and warped with age. Piles of boxes leaned awkwardly in the corners, their cardboard soggy and sagging. Michael froze. On the bed lay a body. It was skeletal, barely human. Skin like paper, pulled taut over brittle bones. The hollow chest rose just barely beneath a threadbare quilt. Its head was bald, the face frozen in a silent scream. The eyes, or where the eyes should have been, were black, empty pits that stared at nothing. Michael stumbled backward, his shoulder slamming into the icy wall. His phone wobbled in his grip, the light trembling across the attic like a nervous pulse. The window rattled again, loud and sudden, and he nearly dropped the phone. His breath came fast, each exhale a cloud of frost. "Calm down," he whispered, his voice ragged and small. "It's just someone who lived here years ago. Maybe they froze to death." But the words tasted like lies. He edged closer, forcing himself to look. The body was dressed in ragged clothes, a button-down shirt and worn trousers, something a farmer might have worn decades ago. The jaw hung slack, yellowed teeth peeking through cracked lips. Michael swallowed, his throat dry. The attic seemed to hold its breath as he reached for the window, trying to shut out the howling wind. His fingers touched the frame. The attic breathed, A cold whisper slid across the back of his neck. Michael turned, bolting down the stairs without looking back. In the main room, the fire still crackled, spreading its orange glow like a fragile shield against the dark. Michael dropped onto the floor beside the stove, panting. He rubbed his hands together, trying to chase away the lingering chill. "It's nothing. Just an old body," he muttered, his voice shaking. "No big deal." But the image wouldn't leave him. The way the empty sockets stared, how the fingers curled like dead spiders against the blanket. He grabbed the metal poker from beside the stove, gripping it tight. If this house had more surprises waiting, he'd be ready. Exhaustion pulled at him again, like a heavy weight. The storm raged outside, snow battering the windows, but in here, the fire's warmth lulled him, muffling his fear. His eyelids fluttered. Sleep crept over him, thick and heavy. A sound woke him. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, above him. The floorboards in the attic groaned under each step. A slow, shuffling movement, as though something was dragging its feet. Michael shot upright, the poker clutched in his shaking hands. "That can't be right," he whispered, his breath frosting in the frigid air. He'd seen that body. It was dead, long dead. The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched out, terrible and endless. Then came the creak of the attic stairs. His heart pounded, every muscle in his body screaming at him to move, to run. But he couldn't. The bottom step groaned, a brittle snap, then a heavy thud, like something collapsing onto the floor. Michael's throat tightened. The silence returned. And then, a sound. Scraping, fingernails or claws, dragging slowly across the wooden boards. A foul smell filled the air, rolling over him like a wave, mildew, rot, and something sickly sweet, like decaying flowers. His stomach turned. A shape appeared in the doorway. It was the corpse from the attic, but now it moved. Its back hunched, limbs twisted, the arms dangling like broken marionette strings. The empty sockets turned toward Michael as though sensing him. The mouth fell open and a sound escaped, a dry, rattling hiss. "Who lit the fire?" it whispered, its voice brittle as dead leaves. "Who woke me up?" Michael didn't think. He lunged forward, swinging the poker with everything he had. The metal struck its back. A sickening crack echoed through the room. The creature crumpled, wheezing and clawing at the floor. "Stay down!" Michael roared, swinging again and again. Bones splintered under each blow, dry and brittle, but still it moved. Finally, it went still. Michael stared at the body, the shattered skull, the lifeless limbs splayed across the floor. It was light, disturbingly so, like a sack of twigs. He grabbed it by the ankles, his hands trembling, and dragged it to the door. The wind howled as he kicked it open, the storm screaming in his face. The corpse tumbled into the snow, where it landed in a broken heap, quickly swallowed by the swirling flakes. Michael slammed the door and fell against it, his breath ragged. He fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a crumpled pack of cigarettes. Lighting one with shaking hands, he took a long, steadying drag. The absurdity of it all hit him like a punch to the gut. He laughed, a short, broken sound. "Guess I earned this," he muttered, staring at the fire. But as he sat there, smoke curling from his lips, something shifted outside. Beneath the howl of the storm, he heard it, faint but unmistakable, the slow scraping of nails against wood, and somewhere, in the dark, a voice whispered, brittle and soft, "Who woke me up?" The cigarette smoke curled around Michael's face, blending with the icy drafts seeping through the cracks. The flickering light of the stove cast shifting shadows on the walls. He pressed his back tighter against the warm metal, his breath slow and shaky. The dead man was gone. He'd tossed the brittle corpse into the snow and slammed the door shut. But the sense of dread clung to him, like frost biting into his skin. The rational part of his mind insisted it was over. A dead man couldn't come back to life. It wasn't possible. But he'd seen it. He'd fought it. The truth was colder than the wind howling outside. He glanced at the door. It held fast, the old wood rattling slightly under the wind's fury. His fingers still ached from gripping the poker. He forced himself to relax, stretching them out. The fire crackled, filling the silence with a deceptive warmth. Suddenly, a soft sound broke the quiet. A muffled thud from upstairs. His eyes snapped toward the ceiling. "No," he whispered. "I threw you out." But the noise came again, a slow, dragging movement. It wasn't the wind. Something was up there. He clenched his jaw, the metallic taste of fear thick on his tongue. He wanted to run, to flee into the storm and leave this nightmare behind. But the memory of trudging through waist-deep snow, of freezing air searing his lungs, anchored him to the spot. Out there was death by cold. In here, at least there was fire. At least there was a chance. Michael took a deep breath and picked up the poker again. His palms were slick with sweat despite the cold. He moved toward the staircase, each step reluctant, his legs trembling beneath him. The stairs loomed like a dark throat, swallowing the dim light. He raised the poker, the metal catching the glow of the fire. He took one step up, then another. The wood groaned underfoot, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. As he neared the top, the air grew colder, biting into his skin. The darkness thickened, his phone's flashlight barely piercing the gloom. He reached the attic door, which hung slightly ajar, a thin line of blackness visible through the gap. He pushed it open with the tip of the poker. The room was just as he'd left it. The sagging bed, the leaning piles of boxes, the cobwebs trembling in the draft. The broken window let in a thin ribbon of icy wind. Snowflakes swirled in, settling on the wooden floor. But the bed was empty. His breath caught. The corpse was gone. He stepped inside, his eyes darting to every shadowed corner. His own breathing was loud in his ears, a frantic rhythm against the silence. He turned, sweeping the light across the room. The boxes. One of the stacks had toppled over, cardboard spilling across the floor. Something had moved through here. He crouched, poking at the debris with the tip of the poker. Old papers, moldy clothes, broken dishes. Nothing sinister, nothing alive. A sound behind him, a faint, wheezing breath. He whipped around, the flashlight beam trembling. Nothing. He was alone. But the air felt wrong, heavy with something unseen, something watching. A cold draft brushed his neck, and he spun back toward the window. The broken pane rattled, the wind moaning through it like a voice. He stepped forward, intending to close it again. The floor shifted beneath his foot. A hollow creak echoed up from below the boards. He froze. Slowly, he knelt and shone the light on the floorboards. They looked solid enough, weathered but intact. But when he pressed his weight down again, the wood gave slightly as if something underneath had settled. A crawl space? His hands shook as he set the poker aside and pried at the edge of the board. It was loose. With a grunt, he lifted it, the wood coming away with a reluctant crack. Beneath the floor was a dark, narrow space, a void that seemed to swallow the light. He leaned closer, the cold air rising from the gap, carrying with it a smell, faint but unmistakable, the scent of rot, of earth long undisturbed, and something else, something sweet, like decaying flowers. Michael's stomach turned. He angled the flashlight down, the beam sweeping across the darkness. A face stared back at him. He fell backward, a scream clawing up his throat but choking off into a strangled gasp. The flashlight rolled across the floor, its beam flickering wildly. The face in the crawl space was pale, almost waxen, the eyes wide open and glassy. The mouth was twisted into a silent scream, lips peeled back to reveal teeth clenched in eternal terror. The skin was drawn tight over the bones, like a doll left too long in the sun. It was another corpse. But unlike the first one, this one hadn't been dead for decades. The flesh was still there, though dried and discolored. The hair was brittle. Clumps of it stuck to the floor of the crawl space. Michael's mind reeled. Who were these people? How had they died here, trapped beneath the floorboards? A faint rustling sound echoed from the dark space. His breath caught. The corpse's eyes didn't move, but the shadows around it seemed to breathe, to shift ever so slightly. Then he saw it. Long, thin fingers, barely visible in the shadows, curled around the edge of the floorboards. Nails yellowed and cracked like claws. They were moving. Something was waking up down there. Michael scrambled back, grabbing the flashlight, the beam shaking wildly. He snatched up the poker and backed toward the door. A whisper floated up from the crawl space, so faint he thought he might be imagining it. Cold. So cold. Then the fingers tightened, and something began to rise from the darkness. He didn't wait to see what it was. He turned and bolted down the stairs, his feet barely touching the steps. The shadows twisted around him, the house groaning as though it were alive. He hit the floor and ran for the front door, yanking it open. The storm screamed in his face, snow biting at his skin. But he didn't care. He stumbled outside, the wind shoving him backward. He turned, ready to flee into the night. But as he looked back at the house, his blood turned to ice. The attic window was no longer empty. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the darkness. Thin, twisted, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Empty eye sockets stared down at him, and a wide, toothy grin split its face. It raised one skeletal hand and waved. Then it disappeared into the shadows. Michael's scream was lost in the wind. The wind howled as Michael staggered back into the house, slamming the door behind him. His breath came in ragged gasps, the cold gnawing at his skin. He leaned his forehead against the door, the rough wood biting into his flesh. "Get it together," he muttered, his voice shaking. His mind raced, trying to process what he'd seen, what he knew he'd seen. The skeletal figure waving from the attic window, that mocking, twisted grin. It was impossible. None of this should be real. But denial was a luxury he could no longer afford. The fire in the stove sputtered, the warmth barely pushing back against the cold creeping in through the cracks. Michael's hands trembled as he added more wood, the flames licking at the dry branches with a hungry hiss. He backed away, eyes darting around the room, every shadow a potential threat. The silence was suffocating. He couldn't stand still, couldn't let the dread sink deeper into his bones. He had to move, had to do something. His gaze landed on the staircase leading to the attic. The thought of going back up there made his stomach twist, but he needed answers. There was no escaping this house, not with the storm howling outside. And if he was trapped here, he needed to know what he was up against. He gripped the poker tightly, its cold metal biting into his palm, and forced himself toward the stairs. Each step felt like walking into a nightmare. The wood creaked beneath his weight, the sound echoing through the house. At the top, the attic door stood slightly ajar. The darkness beyond it felt thicker now, more oppressive. He swallowed hard and pushed the door open. The room was as he'd left it, except for one thing. The bed was empty again. Michael's heart pounded in his chest. He swept the flashlight beam across the room, searching for any sign of movement. The boxes in the corner, the broken window, the dusty floorboards. Nothing seemed out of place. Then from behind him, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." He spun around, the flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. The beam rolled wildly, casting crazed shadows across the walls. A figure stood in the doorway. It was the old man, or what was left of him. The eyeless sockets stared at him, black pits of endless hunger. The mouth twisted into a grin, revealing rows of cracked yellow teeth. "Why did you wake me?" the thing rasped, each word a dry scrape of bone against bone. Michael stumbled back, his foot catching on a loose floorboard. He fell hard, pain exploding in his shoulder. The poker skidded away, clanging against the wall. The figure shuffled closer, each step a brittle creak. Its skeletal fingers flexed, nails clicking together like insects' legs. The air grew colder, the shadows thickening around it. "Please," Michael croaked, his voice barely a whisper. The thing tilted its head as if considering him. "Cold," it sighed. "So cold." Then it lunged. Michael screamed, rolling to the side just as the creature's fingers scraped the floor where his neck had been. He scrambled to his feet, his hands grasping for anything to defend himself. His fingers closed around the flashlight. He swung it wildly, the metal casing striking the figure's skull with a sickening crack. The creature staggered, but didn't fall. Instead, it straightened, the grin stretching wider. "Is that all?" it hissed. Michael's mind screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead. The cold seeped into his bones, freezing him in place. The creature took another step, its fingers reaching for his throat. But then a sound shattered the silence, a low, rumbling growl coming from below. The creature froze, its eyeless sockets widening in surprise. Michael didn't wait to see what was coming. He turned and bolted for the stairs, his feet barely touching the steps as he flew down to the first floor. He hit the ground running, his breath coming in frantic gasps. Behind him, the growl grew louder, deeper, vibrating through the walls. The house itself seemed to shudder, the floorboards trembling beneath his feet. He reached the front door, his fingers fumbling with the latch. The wood was ice cold, the metal biting into his skin. He yanked it open, the wind screaming in his face, but before he could step outside, a force slammed into him from behind. He hit the floor hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. He rolled over, his vision swimming. The creature was above him, its grin gone, replaced by a look of pure rage. "You can't leave," it snarled. "You woke me. You belong here now." It lunged, but before it could reach him, the floor beneath them gave way. A roar erupted from the darkness below, a sound of fury and hunger. The floorboards splintered, and Michael felt himself falling, the world spinning around him. Then, darkness. He hit something cold and wet, the shock of it jolting him back to awareness. He was lying in a basement, or what was left of one. The walls were crumbling, thick roots twisting through the cracks. The air was damp and heavy, the smell of earth and decay filling his nostrils. He pushed himself up, every muscle screaming in protest. Above him, the hole in the floor gaped like a wound, the attic's dim light barely reaching down to where he was. A sound echoed through the darkness, a wet, slithering noise. He turned, his heart hammering. In the shadows, something moved. It was larger than the old man, its shape shifting and writhing as it dragged itself forward. Pale limbs jutted out at odd angles, faces half-formed in the shifting flesh. Eyes opened and closed, mouths whispering words he couldn't understand. It was as if the house itself had given birth to something ancient, something hungry. Michael's mind screamed, his body frozen in terror. The thing surged forward and he ran, blind and desperate, into the waiting dark. Michael's feet pounded against the damp earth as he ran, the darkness clawing at him from every side. His breath was ragged, his chest heaving as he forced his legs to keep moving. The sound of something wet and massive slithering behind him sent waves of cold terror through his body. The basement seemed endless, a maze of crumbling walls, tangled roots, and shifting shadows. The dim light filtering through the hole in the ceiling was quickly swallowed by the darkness. He couldn't tell which direction he was going. He just knew he had to keep moving. A sickly, wet whisper rose from the darkness behind him. "Stay!" The words slithered into his ears, cold and oily. He clenched his teeth, refusing to look back. He didn't want to see what was chasing him. He couldn't bear to see it. He turned a corner and skidded to a halt. A solid stone wall loomed in front of him, blocking his path. His chest tightened with panic. He spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The creature was there. It filled the corridor, a writhing mass of pale flesh and twisted limbs. Faces formed and dissolved across its surface, eyes blinking open only to disappear again. Mouths whispered and moaned, some smiling, others twisted in silent screams. Skeletal arms jutted out, their fingers reaching, clawing at the air. Michael's mind rebelled at the sight. The thing defied logic, defied reality. It was as if the walls of the house had birthed a nightmare, something ancient and unspeakable that had been trapped below for centuries, waiting to be freed. The creature surged forward, the air filling with the stink of decay. Michael's survival instinct kicked in. He turned, his fingers scrabbling against the stone wall. There had to be a way out, a crack, a gap, anything. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices merging into one dreadful sound. "Stay with us!" Cold, wet fingers brushed his shoulder. He jerked away, a scream ripping from his throat. He swung the flashlight wildly, the beam cutting through the gloom and reflecting off something metallic. A door. An old, rusted door set into the stone wall, almost hidden behind a curtain of roots. He lunged for it, tearing the roots aside. The handle was ice cold, the metal biting into his palm. He twisted it desperately. It didn't budge. "No, no, no!" he cried, his voice breaking. He threw his shoulder against the door, the pain radiating through his body. The whispers behind him grew louder, the cold fingers reaching, closing in. With a strangled yell, he rammed the door one last time. It gave way, swinging inward with a deafening screech. He stumbled through, the momentum carrying him forward. The flashlight slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor. He spun around and slammed the door shut, the sound echoing through the space like a gunshot. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the pounding began. The creature slammed into the door, the wood groaning under the impact. The whispers seeped through the cracks, desperate and pleading. "Let us in." Michael backed away, his chest heaving, his heart threatening to burst. His hands fumbled for the flashlight, his fingers finally closing around it. He lifted it, the beam casting wild, shaky light across the room. It was another basement, but this one was different. The walls were lined with shelves, cluttered with dusty jars and old tools. The air was cold and stale, but it lacked the suffocating decay of the corridor he'd just escaped. The pounding at the door grew weaker, the whispers fading. Whatever that thing was, it couldn't get through. For now. He sagged against the wall, his body trembling. His mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. The old man, the attic, the creature. What was this place? What kind of evil had he stumbled into? His gaze landed on a workbench against the far wall. Rusted tools were scattered across it, and above, pinned to the wall, were yellowed papers. He moved closer, the flashlight beam trembling. The papers were old, brittle at the edges. They were handwritten, the ink faded but legible. He squinted at the words. Binding ritual, containment spell, must not be disturbed. The words blurred as his mind struggled to comprehend them. A ritual? A spell? It sounded like something out of a bad horror movie. But the thing behind that door was real. The terror he felt was real. His eyes caught on a phrase at the bottom of the page. The guardian must remain undisturbed. If awakened, it will hunger. A chill seeped into his bones. The guardian. Was that what he had seen in the attic? The skeletal figure with the hollow eyes? And the thing in the basement? Was that what it was guarding? He remembered the old man's whisper. "Why did you wake me?" He had done this. By entering the house, by lighting the fire, by disturbing the stillness. He had awakened something ancient, something that should have stayed buried. The flashlight flickered, the beam dimming. He shook it, his pulse spiking. "Don't die on me now," he muttered. But the light sputtered, then went out, plunging him into darkness. He froze, the silence wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. His breath came in shallow gasps, the darkness pressing against his eyes. A faint sound, the creak of a floorboard, not behind the door, inside the room. His fingers tightened around the flashlight, useless now. He listened, every nerve on edge. Another creak, closer this time, then a whisper, soft and cold. "You woke us." The air chilled to ice. Something moved in the darkness. Michael's scream never left his throat. Michael's scream dissolved into a strangled gasp. The darkness pressed against his eyes, thick and suffocating. The air was ice-cold, chilling him to the marrow. He held the dead flashlight in his trembling hand, heart pounding so hard it threatened to burst through his ribs. He wasn't alone. A whisper curled through the blackness, a voice so close it felt like icy breath on his neck. "You shouldn't be here." His throat clenched. He wanted to scream, but his body refused to obey. The creaking of footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate. Something shifted in the dark, the sound of damp flesh sliding across the floor. He backed away one step at a time until his shoulders bumped against the cold stone wall. His fingers scrabbled over the rough surface looking for anything, a weapon, a door, a way out. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Stay with us." A cold, skeletal hand brushed his cheek. Michael's body jolted, his scream finally breaking free. He swung the flashlight wildly, connecting with something solid. A sickening crack echoed through the basement, followed by a low, inhuman growl. The thing recoiled, and he ran. His feet slipped on the damp ground, but adrenaline propelled him forward. He reached out blindly, his fingers colliding with wood, a door warped and swollen with moisture. He fumbled for the handle, twisted it with a desperate jerk, and stumbled through. The door slammed shut behind him with a hollow boom. He leaned against it, his lungs burning, his mind spinning. The darkness in this new space was just as oppressive, but the air felt different. Colder, but not as suffocating. He tried to steady his breath, listening for sounds of pursuit. Silence. Just the faint drip of water somewhere in the shadows. He took a hesitant step forward, his boots squelching on the wet floor. His hands traced the wall, the rough stones slick with moisture. The space felt larger than the previous room, the air echoing slightly. He crouched, fumbling for the fallen flashlight. When his fingers found it, he gave it a shake, praying for even a flicker of light. Nothing. "Come on, come on," he muttered, smacking it against his palm. A weak beam sputtered to life, flickering like a dying firefly. He aimed it ahead. The pale glow barely pierced the gloom, but it was enough to make out shapes. The room was an old storage cellar, lined with rows of shelves filled with crumbling boxes, rusted tools, and shattered glass jars. The air reeked of mildew and rot, but it wasn't the decay that made his skin crawl. It was the shadows between the shelves. They seemed to move, to breathe, shifting ever so slightly, as if the darkness itself was alive, watching him. He swallowed hard, the sour taste of fear on his tongue. He took a cautious step forward, the flashlight trembling in his grip. The beam swept across the room, illuminating glimpses of forgotten relics, broken pottery, rusted nails, scraps of yellowed cloth. Then the light landed on something else. A figure. It stood perfectly still at the far end of the room, half hidden in the shadows. At first, he thought it was a mannequin, pale, motionless, lifeless. But then it moved. The head lifted slowly, and two hollow eye sockets stared back at him. The mouth cracked open in a grin, revealing rows of crooked, yellowed teeth. Michael's breath caught in his throat. His feet refused to move. The figure stepped forward, the sound of brittle bones grinding together. "You woke us," it whispered, the voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "Now you stay." He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The thing shuffled closer, its skeletal hands twitching. "Please," Michael choked out. I didn't mean to. I didn't know." The figure tilted its head as if considering his words. For a moment, the grin faltered. Then the shadows behind it stirred. More figures emerged, peeling away from the darkness. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, their mouths twisted in silent screams. Skeletal hands reached forward, the air filling with a chorus of dry whispers. "Stay, stay, stay." Panic exploded in his chest. He spun around, the flashlight beam flaring wildly. There had to be a way out, a door, a window, anything. His light caught a narrow passage between the shelves, barely wide enough to squeeze through. He didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, ducking into the gap. The shelves scraped against his shoulders, glass jars shattering at his feet. The whispers rose behind him, the figures closing in. "Stay." He forced his way through the narrow space, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The passage twisted and turned, the darkness pressing in tighter. Splinters clawed at his arms, rusted nails snagged his clothes, but he kept going. The whispers grew louder, the sound like a swarm of insects. Then, up ahead, a faint glow. He pushed toward it, his body screaming in protest. The glow brightened, resolving into the outline of a door. Light seeped through the cracks, pale and cold. He slammed into the door, his hands fumbling for the latch. It was stuck, the wood swollen and warped. He threw his weight against it, the door groaning but refusing to budge. The whispers were right behind him now, the air freezing around his neck. "Stay!" he screamed, a raw sound of desperation, and hurled himself at the door one final time. It gave way, and he tumbled out onto cold, hard ground. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. The whispers were silenced. He lay there, gasping, his face pressed against the snow. The wind howled around him, the cold searing his lungs. He was outside, alive. Barely. He rolled onto his back, the dark sky swirling above him. Snowflakes drifted down, melting on his feverish skin. The house loomed behind him, its windows dark and empty. He forced himself to sit up, every muscle trembling. His eyes locked onto the attic window. For a moment he thought he saw movement, a shadow pulling back, a grin fading into darkness. Then it was gone. The wind howled, carrying away the last echoes of the whispers. Michael staggered to his feet, and he ran. Michael's legs burned, every step a knife stabbing into his muscles. His breath came in ragged gasps, forming clouds in the frigid night air. Snow whipped against his face, stinging like tiny shards of glass. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The dark outline of the house loomed behind him, its windows hollow and black. The attic window seemed to stare at him like a single, unblinking eye. A cold shiver crawled down his spine. He knew if he stopped running, if he looked back for even a second, he might see that twisted grin again, that promise of something worse than death. He plunged into the snowdrifts, his boots sinking with every step. The wind howled, drowning out his gasping breaths. The storm was relentless, the snow falling thicker now, erasing his footprints almost as soon as he made them. Where am I going? The thought clawed at the edges of his mind, but he shoved it down. He just needed to get away, to put distance between him and that house. The basement, the attic, the whispering shadows, they couldn't follow him forever. Could they? A low creaking sound rose above the wind, like wood bending under pressure. His heart stuttered. He glanced back, just once. The house. It was changing. The walls seemed to breathe, the roof sagging as if the entire structure were sinking into the earth. The attic window, that cursed window, folded in on itself, disappearing into the darkness. The walls cracked and splintered, roots and vines erupting through the gaps. The house groaned like a wounded beast, the sound vibrating through the air. Then it was gone. Swallowed by the storm, the shape of it lost in the swirling snow. Michael's knees buckled and he collapsed into the drifts, his chest heaving. The cold bit into his skin, numbing his fingers and toes. He wanted to keep moving, but his body refused. He lay there, shivering, staring up at the sky. The storm was relentless. Snowflakes spun and danced, blurring the line between earth and sky. The world was an endless white void, cold and empty. He closed his eyes, his body trembling. I can't stop here. I'll freeze. I have to keep going. But the exhaustion was too deep, the cold too strong. His thoughts grew sluggish, his limbs heavy. Darkness crept in at the edges of his mind. Then, through the haze, he heard something. A voice. Faint and distant, barely audible over the wind. "Hey, you there!" His eyes fluttered open. A figure moved through the snow, a beam of light cutting through the darkness. The shape grew clearer. A man, bundled in a heavy coat, a flashlight in one hand. "Hold on!" the man shouted, his voice muffled by the storm. "I'm coming!" Michael's lips parted, but no sound came out. His body was too cold, his throat too dry. The man reached him, kneeling in the snow, his gloved hand gripping Michael's shoulder. "Jesus, you're half frozen," the man said. "Can you stand? Come on, let's get you out of here." Michael nodded weakly, his body barely responding. The man hooked an arm under his shoulders, lifting him to his feet. "There's a truck nearby," the man said. "You'll be okay. We just have to get you warmed up." Michael leaned against him, each step a struggle. The man's flashlight bobbed ahead of them, guiding the way. Shapes loomed in the darkness, trees half buried in snowdrifts. The wind howled through the branches, a ghostly wail that seemed to follow them. The man's grip tightened. Almost there, just a little farther. Through the blur of snow, Michael saw it. The dark outline of a truck, its headlights cutting through the storm. Relief flooded through him, a weak sob escaping his lips. They reached the truck, and the man yanked the door open, helping Michael inside. The blast of warm air was a shock, the heat burning his frozen skin. He collapsed onto the seat, his body trembling uncontrollably. The man climbed in after him, slamming the door shut. The world outside was still a swirling white hell, but in here, it was warm. Safe. "Name's Jack," the man said, pulling off his gloves. "You're lucky I found you. This storm's a killer." Michael nodded, his teeth chattering. Thank you." Jack cranked the heat, the vents blasting warm air. He turned to Michael, his brow furrowed. "What were you doing out there anyway? There's nothing for miles." Michael swallowed, his throat raw. He didn't know how to explain. The house, the whispers, the thing in the basement. It all sounded insane. "Got lost," he muttered. It was the closest thing to the truth he could manage. Jack nodded slowly. "Well, you're not the first. These storms come out of nowhere. Best to stay off the roads until they clear." Michael leaned back, the warmth seeping into his bones. The fear slowly ebbed away, replaced by bone-deep exhaustion. His eyelids grew heavy, his mind drifting. But just as he was about to slip into sleep, Jack spoke again. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "there used to be an old house out here. People said it was haunted, burned down years ago, though. Nothing left but rumors and bad memories." Michael's eyes snapped open. He turned to Jack, his heart hammering. "Burned down?" he whispered. "When?" Jack shrugged. "Must have been 20 years ago, maybe more. Locals always said it was cursed. Funny how stories like that never really go away." Michael's mouth went dry. His hands clenched the edge of the seat. The house, the whispers, the things that chased him. Had it all been real? Or had he wandered into a nightmare born from old, twisted memories? Jack started the truck, the engine growling to life. The headlights pierced the storm, the road ahead a tunnel of white. "Don't worry," Jack said. "We'll be out of this storm soon." Michael nodded, but a cold knot settled in his stomach. He stared out the window, the shadows of the storm twisting and shifting. In the darkness, he thought he saw it, a shape, a grin, a hollow stare, watching, waiting. The truck rumbled forward, leaving the past behind. But some things, he knew, never really stayed buried. The truck rumbled through the storm, its headlights carving a narrow path through the swirling white. Michael leaned against the window, his breath fogging the glass. The warmth inside the cab seeped into his bones, but his fingers still felt numb, his mind still buzzing with fear. Jack drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The windshield wipers thumped rhythmically, barely keeping up with the snow piling against the glass. The storm showed no signs of easing, the wind howling like a living thing. Michael's eyelids fluttered, exhaustion pulling at him, but every time he drifted too far, memories dragged him back. The house, the whispers, the thing in the basement. His chest tightened. It felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Jack's voice broke the silence. "We're coming up on an old service station. I'll stop there, get you warmed up properly." Michael nodded, his voice too raw to respond. He peered through the windshield, searching for any sign of civilization. Faint lights glowed through the storm, growing clearer as they approached. A squat, lonely building, its sign swinging wildly in the wind. The word "service" flickered, some of the neon letters dark. Jack pulled into the lot, the tires crunching over ice. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence felt deafening. The wind still battered the truck, the storm pressing in on all sides. "Let's get inside," Jack said, opening his door. "Careful, it's slick out here." Michael's legs were stiff as he stepped out, his boots skidding on the ice. The cold hit him like a wall, but he followed Jack toward the building. The door creaked open, a bell above it jingling weakly. Warm air greeted them, stale, tinged with oil and old coffee, but comforting. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow. The place was empty, a few old chairs lined against the wall, a dusty counter piled with faded maps and outdated magazines. Jack gestured to one of the chairs. "Sit down. I'll see if they have a first aid kit or something hot to drink." Michael sank into the chair, his body sagging with relief. He stared at the cracked linoleum floor, his mind a blur. The warmth felt good, but something gnawed at the edges of his thoughts, a sense that it wasn't over, that the storm, the house, the things he saw, they were still with him. The bell above the door jingled again. His head snapped up. Jack was still behind the counter, rummaging through a cabinet. The door hung open, the wind pushing snow inside, but no one was there. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather seeped into his veins. He stood slowly, his eyes fixed on the open door. The storm outside was a wall of white, the night beyond it dark and impenetrable. He took a step forward, his breath shallow. "Jack?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack's head popped up. "What is it?" Michael didn't answer. He stepped closer to the door, peering into the storm. Something moved in the darkness. A shadow, tall, thin, twisted. The cold air rushed in, swirling around his feet. He took another step, his mind screaming at him to stop, to close the door and stay inside. But his body moved on its own, pulled by something he couldn't explain. The shadow stepped closer, resolving into a figure. The old man. The eyeless sockets stared at him, black voids in a face twisted by decay. The mouth cracked open in a smile, teeth yellow and crooked. "You thought you could leave," the old man whispered. The words carried on the wind, dry and brittle. "But you woke us, and we are hungry." Michael stumbled back, his heart slamming against his ribs. Jack's hand clamped onto his shoulder. "Hey, what's wrong?" Michael turned, his eyes wild. "We have to go, now!" Jack frowned. "Go where? The storm's—" The wind shrieked, and the door slammed shut on its own. The bell jangled furiously, the lights flickering overhead. The temperature in the room plummeted, their breath turning to mist. The shadows stretched, deepened. A whisper curled through the air, the same voices from the house, the basement. "Stay with us." The windows frosted over, cracks spiderwebbing through the glass. The door rattled in its frame as if something outside was clawing to get in. Michael's hands shook. "They followed me. They followed me here." Jack's face paled. "Who?" The door burst open. A wave of cold air flooded the room and the shadows poured in, shapes barely visible, eyes like dark holes, fingers like brittle twigs. The whispers rose to a deafening chorus, words he couldn't understand but felt in his bones. Jack grabbed a wrench from the counter. "What the hell is this?" The shadows lunged. Michael fell back, the cold wrapping around him like a shroud. He heard Jack shouting, metal clanging, but it was distant, muffled. The darkness was everywhere, pressing into his eyes, his mouth, his lungs. He couldn't breathe. The last thing he saw was the old man's grin, wider than ever, eyes like black stars, pulling him down, down, into the dark. Michael's eyes snapped open. He was lying on cold pavement, the wind howling around him. The storm had stopped. The sky was a blank slate of gray, dawn just beginning to break. He sat up, his body aching. The service station was gone. No building, no truck, no Jack. Just a field of untouched snow. He staggered to his feet, the cold gnawing at his skin. He turned in a slow circle, his heart pounding. Nothing. Only the wind, whispering through the empty trees. He was alone. A sound behind him, soft, almost lost in the wind. A whisper. "Stay." He didn't turn around. He started walking, one foot in front of the other, leaving a trail of footprints that the wind quickly began to erase. And behind him, the whispers followed. The snow-covered field stretched into the pale horizon, its endless white surface hiding everything that lay beneath, secrets, memories, nightmares that refused to stay buried. The cold wind swept across the open land, whispering through skeletal branches, carrying echoes of voices no one else could hear. Michael stumbled away from the place where the service station had once stood. His boots crunched over snow that seemed to grow deeper with every step. Behind him, the wind swept away his footprints, erasing all evidence that he'd ever been there. He didn't look back. He couldn't. There was nothing to see. Nothing but emptiness. A hollow space where a building, a person, and his own sanity had once been. The storm had passed, leaving behind a fragile stillness. The dawn light painted the sky in streaks of gray and pale gold. It should have felt like hope, like a new beginning. But to Michael, it felt like the end of something he couldn't quite name. The warmth of the sunrise didn't reach his skin. The cold had settled too deeply into his bones. He wrapped his arms around himself, shivering. But it wasn't just the temperature that made him tremble. It was the memory of what he had seen, what he had survived. The house, the whispers, the darkness that clawed at the edges of his mind. He tried to push the thoughts away, to convince himself it was over. But the truth clung to him like frostbite, numb at first, then spreading pain. He trudged forward, the snow growing heavier with each step, as if the earth itself were trying to pull him back. His mind felt fractured, torn between the desperate need to keep moving and the crushing weight of exhaustion. How long had he been walking? Hours? Days? Time had lost its meaning in the storm. All he knew was that he had to get away. Away from the house, away from the whispers that still echoed in his head. "Stay with us." He shook his head violently, trying to clear the voice from his mind. It was like a splinter buried too deep to remove, a part of him now. He clung to the hope that if he kept moving, if he reached civilization, if he felt warmth again, the voice would fade. That the nightmare would become just another strange story, the kind you hear around a campfire and dismiss as fiction. But deep down, he knew the truth. Some things couldn't be left behind. Hours later, the world around him shifted. The endless white gave way to the dark outline of trees, their bare branches twisting like skeletal fingers. He staggered through them, each step a battle against the fatigue threatening to pull him under. His legs felt like lead, his lungs burned with each breath of icy air. He wasn't sure if he was moving forward anymore or just walking in circles, lost in the labyrinth of his own desperation. Then finally, he saw it. A road. It was barely more than a strip of gray cutting through the snow, but to Michael, it was salvation. He fell to his knees on the icy pavement, the cold seeping through his jeans. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stared at the empty road, half expecting it to vanish like everything else. But it stayed. Solid. Real. In the distance, a low rumble broke the silence. A vehicle. Headlights pierced through the thin veil of snow, growing brighter as they approached. He tried to stand, but his legs refused to cooperate. He raised a trembling hand instead, waving weakly. The vehicle slowed, a truck, dark and heavy, its tires crunching over the frozen road. The window rolled down, and a woman leaned out, her face etched with concern. "Hey, are you okay?" she shouted, her voice barely carrying over the wind. Michael tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He nodded instead, tears freezing on his cheeks. "Hold on," she said. She jumped out of the truck, her boots crunching over the ice as she hurried toward him. "Jesus, you're half frozen. Here, let me help you." She wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, the fabric rough and scratchy, but blessedly warm. She guided him to the truck, her grip strong and steady. "Where did you come from?" she asked once they were inside, the truck's heater blasting warm air. "There's nothing out here for miles." Michael's voice was a rasp. "Got lost in the storm." She nodded, her eyes narrowing with suspicion but saying nothing. He didn't blame her. The truth was something neither of them wanted to confront. Instead, she focused on driving, the road winding through the snow-covered landscape. The warmth seeped into his limbs, but the cold in his chest remained. He stared out the window, watching the world slip by. The trees, the fields, the distant hills. They all seemed normal, safe. But every shadow, every flicker of movement at the edge of his vision made his heart lurch. He closed his eyes, trying to find peace in the hum of the engine, the steady rhythm of tires on pavement. But the whispers followed him into the darkness behind his eyelids. "You woke us." Days passed. He was checked into a hospital, treated for frostbite and exhaustion. The doctors asked questions: where he'd been, what had happened. He gave them the simplest answers he could, leaving out the parts that didn't fit reality. The parts that felt like madness. When he was finally discharged, he tried to pick up the pieces of his life. The city felt different now. Its noises too loud, its lights too bright. He wandered through crowds, surrounded by people, but the isolation never left him. The cold was still there, a phantom pain that no heater or blanket could chase away. At night, he dreamed of snow-covered fields, of a house that shouldn't exist, of hollow eyes watching him from the shadows. He woke up sweating, his heart pounding, the whispers still echoing in his ears. He told himself it was just a memory, just trauma playing tricks on his mind. But sometimes when he was alone, in the quiet moments between one breath and the next, he felt it. A presence. A cold breath on the back of his neck. A whisper, so faint he almost couldn't hear it. "Stay." And deep inside, he knew the truth. He had escaped the storm. He had escaped the house. But he hadn't escaped them. And he never would.